Adrian Kovar had not moved in 11 minutes, and every man on the wall had learned a long time ago not to ask why. What none of them knew, not the guard at the south post, not the gardener pretending to work the hedge, not the woman on the third floor who was about to lose 10 years off her life. In the next 30 seconds was that 30 paces away, behind the old stone wall, a phone had been recording for 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Someone had waited a full week for exactly this. And then a 5-year-old girl in a yellow dress walked up, climbed into the lap of the most dangerous man in Holloway Bay, and fell asleep. Thank you for being here, my wonderful story family. If this already has you leaning in, hit subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end, and drop the city you're watching from in the comments, because I love seeing how far these stories travel. So, the cat was orange, half-starved, and missing most of one ear, and Ivy Cole had decided within 4 seconds of seeing it that it belonged to her. She had been told to stay in the small back room off the kitchen. She had been told this twice, once in her mother's ordinary voice, and once in the other voice, the low, flat one that meant her mother was frightened about something she wasn't going to explain. Ivy had listened to both. She had sat on the folding chair with her coloring book for what felt to her like an entire year, and was in fact 19 minutes. Then the cat crossed the window. She was 5 years old. She had slept 3 of the last 8 nights in the backseat of a car that smelled like gasoline and old coffee, with her mother's coat over her legs and her mother's hand resting on her ankles so she'd know if Ivy moved. She had eaten dinner standing up in a gas station. She had been told they were on an adventure, and she had believed it for the first 4 cities and stopped believing it somewhere around the 5th, though she had never said so out loud, because even at 5 she had worked out that her mother needed her to keep believing it. So when a one-eared orange cat walked past a window in the biggest house Ivy had ever been inside, she did not think about rules. She thought finally something good. The door gave under her shoulder without much of a fight. The afternoon was warm and enormous and gold, and the cat was already 20 feet ahead, unhurried, tail up, moving along the hedge like it had somewhere important to be, and was politely allowing her to follow. She followed. She went past a fountain she didn't look at twice. She went past a black car with a man sitting inside it who glanced up, registered a small child in a yellow dress with a black bow tied crooked in her hair, and had absolutely no protocol for what to do about it. She went past the gardener who straightened up with the shears still in his hand and opened his mouth and then closed it again because the child had already gone by him, and because the part of the garden she was heading toward was the part where nobody went in the afternoons, and because saying something meant explaining afterward how she'd gotten past him in the first place. He decided he would go find someone. By the time he decided it, she was already around the corner. The cat led her to the old cedar at the far end of the lawn, and then without any warning at all went straight up the trunk and vanished into the branches, and Ivy stood underneath it with her hands on her hips and her whole heart broken. That was when she noticed the man on the bench. She looked at him for a while before she went any closer, which she would not have been able to explain to anyone because she wasn't afraid. Ivy Cole had a very accurate instrument in her chest for telling the difference between men who were dangerous and men who were dangerous to her, and it had been calibrated early and hard, and it did not go off. What she noticed instead was that he looked tired. Not sleepy tired, the other kind. The kind her mother looked at the end of a driving day when she'd been holding the wheel with both hands for 9 hours and finally let go of it. His eyes were closed and his head was tipped back a little, and one arm rested along the top of the bench. And to Ivy, he did not look like a man who was resting. He looked like a man who was pretending to rest so that people would leave him alone. She recognized that. She did it herself in the car so her mother wouldn't feel bad about the driving. She walked up and stood in front of him and considered the empty space beside him, and then considered his shoulder, and then said in the extremely reasonable tone of a person conducting a small business transaction, "Excuse me, can I borrow your shoulder? I'm not going to be heavy." He did not answer because he had not yet decided whether she was real. Adrian Kovar had felt her from the moment her shoes hit the gravel. That was the thing nobody understood about the stillness. It was not rest, and it had never been rest. It was the most alert he ever got. 22 years of living the way he lived had trained something underneath his thinking to catalog every sound within 40 feet and sort it instantly into nothing and something and small shoes on gravel closing distance, unannounced, while both his hands were open and empty and his eyes were shut. That was something. His hand had already begun to move toward the inside of his jacket before his eyes were open. It was not a decision. It had stopped being a decision around the third year. And then his eyes were open, and there was a child standing in front of him with a black bow coming untied in a mess of dark curls, waiting politely for permission to lean on him, and his hand was still halfway inside his coat. He took it out very slowly as though the movement itself might be evidence of something. She did not wait for the answer. She had asked which in her understanding of manners was the entire obligation, and then she climbed up onto the bench and turned around twice like a small dog and settled sideways against his chest with her cheek just under his collarbone, and both hands closed around a fistful of his shirt. Adrian sat with his arms suspended 2 inches above her back. He could not put it down. He was aware of how absurd that was in the abstract, the way a man can be aware his own house is on fire while he stands in the kitchen doing nothing. He had buried 3 men with his own hands. He had ordered enough others buried that he had stopped keeping a number, because keeping a number meant thinking about the number. He had built an entire life on one principle given to him by his father in this same garden when he was 9 years old and had cried about a dog. The moment you let something close enough to touch you is the moment you have already lost it. And a 5-year-old had just walked through 40 armed men past 2 cameras and a checkpoint and put her face against his heart and gone to sleep in under 90 seconds. Her breathing had already dropped into that deep, sloppy, unguarded rhythm that only happens when a body has decided completely and without reservation that it is safe. Nobody had ever made that assumption about him. Not his men who obeyed him, not the men across from him at tables who negotiated with him carefully the way you'd negotiate with weather. Not the woman he'd almost married at 26 who had loved him, and had also, he understood later, never once fallen asleep before he did. He looked down at the top of her head, at the crooked bow, at the breadcrumb dried at the corner of her mouth, at one small fist gripping his shirt so tightly that the fabric had pulled loose from under his belt. Something inside his chest, something he would have said an hour ago, had gone permanently quiet, pulled tight, and then impossibly let go. He put his hand down. He put it flat on her back between her shoulder blades and felt her lungs working under his palm and did not move again. Maren Cole had turned away from the third-floor window for 41 seconds. That was the number she would carry for the rest of her life. 41 seconds to sign for a delivery of linen. She came back to the room and the folding chair was empty and the coloring book was on the floor and the back door was standing open, and she went down 2 flights of stairs without any memory afterward of taking a single one of them. She came around the hedge at a dead run, a laundry basket still hooked over one arm, and then the basket was on the grass and she was standing absolutely still, and every drop of blood had left her face. Her daughter was asleep on Adrian Kovar. Maren had been in this house 11 days. She had been told exactly 2 things about the man who owned it. The first from the agency was that the pay was excellent and no one asked questions. The second from Teresa in the kitchen on her first morning, delivered without looking up from the stove. You don't speak to him unless he speaks first, and you don't look at him longer than you have to. And if you're smart, you'll make sure he never learns your name. Teresa had said it kindly. That was the part that had frightened her. Maren had spent 8 months learning exactly what happens to a woman who makes a mistake in front of the wrong man. She had the receipts on her ribs. She knew the sound a house makes when it decides you've stepped over a line. And her 5-year-old daughter was currently sleeping on the chest of a man whose staff would not say his name above a whisper, and Maren's whole body had gone to ice, and her mouth was moving before she had any plan for what it was going to say. "Sir, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. She doesn't. I'll take her right now. I'll take her, please." She didn't mean. Adrian raised one hand, not sharply. He had a way of raising a hand that ended conversations in rooms full of grown men. And this was not that. This was 3 inches palm out, almost gentle. "She's fine," he said. And then in a voice that surprised him more than it surprised her, "Don't wake her yet." Maren didn't move. She didn't know if she was permitted to move. She stood there with her hands hanging at her sides, and her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. And the man looked back down at her daughter and did nothing at all except keep his hand on her back. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She sat on the absolute edge of the bench, as far from him as the iron would allow, her body turned toward Ivy at an angle that would let her snatch the child up in half a second if she had to. She was still holding one sock. She had no memory of picking it up. Neither of them said anything for a long time. She doesn't do this, Maren said eventually, mostly because the silence had become unbearable and she was more afraid of it than of speaking. She doesn't sleep for anyone but me. Not in months. She won't even go down for a nap unless she can hear me in the next room. Adrian didn't answer right away. He was looking at the child with an expression Maren couldn't read at all, which under any other circumstances would have terrified her, and somehow didn't. How old? 5 in March. She's small for it. I know. Maren's voice caught on the two words and she hated that it did. It's been a hard year for eating regular. She heard herself say it and immediately wanted it back. 11 days in this house and she had a rule, one single rule, the same rule she'd had in the last 3 places, say nothing that can be repeated. She had never once broken it. She had gotten so good at saying nothing that Ivy's preschool teacher in the second city had written a note home wondering whether Maren spoke English. Teresa told you not to bring her here, Adrian said. It wasn't a question, so Maren didn't insult either of them by pretending it might be. She did. But you brought her anyway. My sutter quit this morning. The words came out flat and fast and too honest. By text, at 6, I called every number I have, which is 4 numbers, and 2 of them are people who don't answer anymore. And I'm not... She stopped, breathed. I don't have anyone else. There isn't anyone else. I didn't have a second choice, sir. I had this or I had losing the job, and I can't lose the job. Why not? And that was the question that undid her, because it was asked without heat, without threat, without the slightest interest in punishing her for the answer. And Maren Cole had not been asked a real question by a man in a very long time. Because it's the 4th one in 8 months, she said. She told him. She never afterward understood why, and she thought about it for years. Part of it was the shock. Part of it was that he wasn't looking at her. He kept his eyes on Ivy the whole time. And it turned out that was the only condition under which she could still do this. Part of it was that he never once said that's terrible or I'm so sorry or any of the things people said that made her feel like an exhibit. But most of it was that her daughter was asleep on him, and some animal part of Maren's brain had already registered what her conscious mind had not yet agreed to, that, whatever this man was. Ivy had walked up to him with her instrument running, and it had not gone off, and Ivy's instrument had never once been wrong. She told him about Wade. She told it the way she always told it, in a voice sanded down from repeating it silently to herself 1,000 times, all the edges worn off, so it couldn't cut her on the way out. He drank. For 4 years before she understood what that was going to mean for the two of them. It started as raising his voice, and then it was a hand, and she had told herself she could manage it, that it was between the two of them, that she could keep it there. And then one night, I couldn't keep it there, she said. She looked down at Ivy's fist in Adrian's shirt. She was 3. She didn't say the rest of that sentence. She didn't need to. Adrian Kovar had spent his entire life reading the shape of what men refused to say, and the silence after that one told him everything. You went to the police, he said. Maren laughed. It came out short and ugly and entirely without humor. I filed a report. I have the number memorized. I had the number memorized. I don't even remember it now. It's been so long. She shook her head slowly. An officer came. He was nice. He wrote everything down. He said it would be investigated, and he gave me a card and told me to call if I felt unsafe. And I believed every word of it, because why wouldn't I? And Wade's brother is a deputy 2 counties over. Adrian said nothing. Nobody ever called me back, Maren said. 6 weeks. 6 weeks I waited, and I checked in twice. And both times someone was going to look into it and get back to me. And then one Tuesday I came home, and Wade was standing in my kitchen making coffee like nothing had ever happened in his life. And he looked at me and he said, she stopped. He said, you made your call. Now let's see whose phone rings. She had left the city that raised him. Then she had left the county that protected him because he found the first place in 5 weeks. Then she had left the place after that and the place after that. This is the 4th job in 8 months, and she said, 4th apartment, 4th school she's not going to finish a term at. Her hands had started to shake, and she pressed them flat against her thighs to stop it. I keep thinking I'm going to run out of places. And then I remember I already have. This was the last one on the list. The agency said the pay was good and nobody would ask questions, and I didn't care what that was supposed to mean because for the first time since March, Wade doesn't know what state I'm in. And then she heard the whole thing back in her own ears. Everything she had just handed to a stranger. A man whose business she did not dare guess, at a man whose staff were afraid to say his name, and she braced. She braced the way she had learned to brace shoulders and chin-down eyes on the middle distance. Adrian was quiet for a long moment. His eyes went from Marin's face down to the small weight against his chest and back up again. "He won't find you here," he said. It landed wrong, or rather it landed nothing like reassurance. People had said versions of that to her before: her sister, a shelter coordinator, a landlord who wanted his deposit. They had all said it the way you say a hope. Adrian Kovar said it the way a man reads out a fact he has already decided to make true. Marin didn't know what to do with that at all. So she did nothing, and neither did he, and the two of them sat under the cedar with a sleeping 5-year-old between them, while the light went from gold to amber to a low-burning copper. And at some point she could not have said, when Marin's shoulders came down from around her ears for the first time in 8 months. Behind the garden wall, 30 paces off, the phone kept recording. Whoever was holding it had been out there since a little after 4. They had been out there 4 of the last 6 days. They had a very specific brief, and they had been beginning to think it was unfillable because the man never did anything. He sat. He didn't smoke, didn't take calls in the garden, didn't meet anyone there. 6 days of a man being unreachable, which was in its own way exactly the problem. And then a child had walked into the frame. At 41 seconds, the recording caught the moment Adrian Kovar put his hand down on the girl's back. It caught the fractional change in his face. It caught, in the far edge of the frame, the housekeeper sitting on the bench beside him, with her whole body angled toward the child like a compass needle. The phone stopped. The person behind the wall looked at the screen for a long moment. Then they trimmed it and sent it, and it left Ashgrove at 6:52 in the evening, and by 9 o'clock that same night it had been watched in a room 400 miles away 11 times. Ivy woke up hungry, which was how she woke up from everything. She sat up on Adrian's chest, looked at her mother, looked at Adrian, looked at the branches of the cedar where a certain orange cat had committed a serious betrayal, and announced with real grievance, "He went up the tree." "He did," Adrian said. "He wasn't supposed to go up the tree." "No." "Is he yours?" "No." Ivy considered this. Then she considered Adrian's face up close, in the way 5-year-olds consider faces without any of the social machinery that makes adults look away. She looked at the black hair combed straight back, and the short beard, and the tattoo running up out of his open collar onto the side of his neck. She put one finger on it. Marin made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when their child touches a live wire. And she was already reaching, and Adrian shook his head very slightly once, and she stopped with her hand in the air. "That's a bird," Ivy said. "It is." "Why is it on your neck?" "So I remember something." "What?" Adrian looked at her for a second longer than the question required. "Somebody I lost," he said. Ivy accepted that with total gravity, patted his neck twice as though offering condolences, and then slid down off the bench and asked her mother whether there was going to be dinner. Marin spent the next hour and a half waiting to be fired. She went through the evening on autopilot, folding, stacking, wiping, all the while running the arithmetic of what came next. What was in the car? What was in the room? How much cash was in the coffee tin? How many hours of driving she had in her before her hands started to shake? $91. Maybe 4 hours. She'd done it on less. Teresa found her at 8:30 in the linen room with her hands full of towels she'd already folded twice. "You're not being let go," Teresa said. "You don't know that. I've been in this house 19 years. Teresa took the towels off her without ceremony and put them on the shelf. "I know exactly what it looks like when someone's being let go. It doesn't look like this." "Then what does this look like?" Teresa didn't answer for a moment. She had a face like a shut door, which was how she'd survived 19 years, and something moved behind it that Marin couldn't read. "Get your things together," Teresa said. "Both of you." Marin's stomach dropped straight through the floor. "You just said, you're not being let go. You're being moved." 2 of them came at 9. They were enormous and quiet and unfailingly polite, and one of them, a broad, soft-spoken man named Bruno, who Ivy would decide within an hour was the single funniest human being she had ever encountered, carried Marin's entire life across the courtyard in 2 trips. That was the part that stayed with her. 2 trips, 1 suitcase, 1 duffel of Ivy's clothes, 1 cardboard box, and a stuffed rabbit missing an ear that Bruno carried separately under one arm, like it was fragile. The East Wing had been closed since before most of the current staff had been hired. 3 connected rooms with tall windows and furniture under sheets built for a family that Adrian's father had always intended to have more of and never did. Nobody had opened those doors in years. They were open now. Maren stood in the doorway of what was about to become her bedroom and found that she couldn't make herself walk into it. "There's a mistake," she said. These aren't staff rooms." "No, ma'am." "Then there's a mistake." Bruno set the duffel down. "Mr. Kovar gave the instruction himself," he said in the tone of a man who did not consider that a thing anyone argued with and had never once in his life been proven wrong about it. Maren looked past him at the bed. It had sheets on it. Someone had put fresh sheets on it, and a vase of cut roses on the table by the window, and Maren stood there in the doorway of a room that smelled like roses instead of dust, and felt for the first time in 8 months something that was not fear and did not have a name and frightened her almost as much. "I didn't ask for this," she said. To nobody, to the room. Behind her, Ivy had already made her decision. She dragged the one-eared rabbit through all 3 rooms in a slow procession, evaluating each one like a woman inspecting apartments, rejected the largest on grounds she declined to explain, and settled on the smallest, the one with the window seat, by lying down flat in the middle of the floor and refusing to get up. "This one," she said to her. Adrian did not come to the East Wing that night. He stood at the window of his study instead with the lights off, looking down at the shape of the cedar in the dark. And he did what he always did with things he didn't understand. He built a reason for it. The reason was operational. A housekeeper quartered closer to the main house was more useful. A child underfoot in the staff hall was a liability he'd rather not manage twice. 2 people with no protection and a violent man looking for them living in the least secure building on the property. That was a problem waiting to arrive, and he had simply solved it early. Tidy, defensible. The kind of reason that would hold up if anyone thought to ask. Nobody would think to ask. Nobody in that house had asked him anything in 9 years. He believed the reason for approximately 4 days. There was a knock. Silas Renner never came in without knocking, and never knocked more than twice, and had never in 12 years raised his voice in Adrian's presence. "You wanted me, no," Adrian said, "but you came anyway." Silas smiled slightly. He had a way of standing with his hands folded in front of him, patient as a clock. He was 51 and looked 45 and had run security for the family since before Adrian's father died, and he was the closest thing to an uncle Adrian had ever had. "The East Wing," Silas said. "What about it?" "I'd like to be careful how I say this." Silas let the pause sit. "Because I understand there are personal considerations, and I want to be clear that I'm not questioning your judgment. Say it the way you'd say anything else. You've opened a sealed wing of this house to 2 people we can't verify." Silas's voice never changed pitch, not once the entire time. "The agency file on her is 4 lines long. We have no family confirmed, no history confirmed, nothing at all, past what she told you herself this afternoon on a bench while she was frightened. And forgive me, but a frightened woman with a child is the single most reliable cover there is and always has been." Adrian said nothing. "I'm not suggesting cruelty," Silas went on. "Put them somewhere good, somewhere paid for, somewhere well outside the operational perimeter of this house. That's better for them than it is for us." A beat. "You've made enemies who would enjoy very much finding out you have something to lose. A house with 40 armed men in it is not a safe place for 2 people who don't know how to survive in one." And that was the thing. It was not a bad argument. It was in fact so close to the argument Adrian had been making to himself at 3 in the morning that it landed harder than Silas could possibly have intended. He had lain awake more than once already, 4 nights to be exact, 4 nights out of 11 turning over the identical fear from the identical angle. The safest place in the world for that woman and that child is nowhere near me. "I'll think about it," Adrian said. It was as close as he ever came to ending a conversation without deciding anything, and Silas, who could read him better than anyone alive, inclined his head and let it go. Adrian would think about that later, how easily Silas let it go. How a man who had argued with him for 20 minutes about a driver's route in March had made his case about the East Wing exactly once cleanly and then never raised it again. At the time, he thought it was respect. By the end of the first week, the house had changed, and nobody in it would say so out loud. It started with the sound. Ashgrove had always been silent in a particular way. The silence of men waiting for orders of rooms that existed to be walked through rather than lived in. Now there was a small, aggressively off-key voice singing somewhere upstairs at 7 in the morning, and none of the guards who heard it seemed to know what to do about it, except that not one of them asked her to stop. Bruno found a box of wooden blocks in a storage closet and left them stacked by the window like he hadn't meant anything by it. Teresa started making a second pot of something at 4 o'clock and would not discuss why. One of the men on the south rotation began without any discussion doing his afternoon walk-by on the east side instead of the west. And Adrian Kovar started coming home early. I didn't announce it. Nothing changed on paper. But where he used to sit at the harbor office long past the point where the day's work was done, going through ledgers, nobody else was permitted to see, he now found himself ending meetings a few minutes short, taking the direct road, coming back through the gates while there was still light left. He told himself it was oversight. He told himself a man in his position could not leave two unprotected people in his house unsupervised and call it responsible. He believed that until the sixth evening when he walked into the drawing room and Ivy Cole informed him with the absolute unquestionable authority of a 5-year-old that he was required to come and look at a tower before dinner, and that dinner would not be happening until he did. So Adrian Kovar, who had, in that exact room 4 years earlier, conducted a conversation that one of the two participants had not walked out of, got down on the floor in a tailored suit and let a child explain to him in mostly nonsense why the blue block had to go on top. Murren watched from the doorway with a dish towel in her hands and did not trust herself to make a single sound. There was a moment near the end of that first week that Maren would come back to over and over. Ivy had gotten hold of the notion that Adrian's watch was magic. He wore a silver one, heavy old, and there was a second one he carried in his pocket that he touched every single morning without appearing to know he was doing it. Maren had noticed it on day 3 and filed it away because noticing things was how she'd stayed alive. Ivy had noticed it too, and Ivy had no filing system. "Why do you keep touching that?" she demanded at the dinner table in front of Teresa and Bruno, and two men whose names Maren didn't know. The room went very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the question and everything to do with the fact that a child had just asked Adrian Kovar to explain himself. Adrian put down his fork. "It was my father's," he said. "Where is he gone? Did he die?" "Yes." Ivy thought about this while chewing. Then she reached over and put her hand flat on his forearm, the same gesture she'd made on his neck. Condolences offered and closed, and said, "Okay," and went back to her potatoes. Nobody at that table moved, and Maren, watching from 3 feet away, with her heart going like a bird, understood two things at once, and one of them frightened her far more than the other. The first was that her daughter had done something to this man that no one in his life had ever done, and he had let her. The second was that 11 days ago they had been sleeping in a car, and today Maren had gone 4 straight hours without checking the road behind her, and that if this ended, if this turned out to be another place she had to leave in the dark, it was not going to be like the other 4, because you can survive losing something you never let yourself want. She had already, without permitting it, started to want this. The photograph arrived on the 12th day. It came in an unmarked envelope in the household post, which Teresa sorted every morning at the kitchen counter and left in stacks for the staff, and Maren picked hers up on her way through with a laundry basket on her hip and didn't open it for 3 hours because there was work to do. When she finally did open it, standing alone in the linen room and at 10 past 2 in the afternoon, what fell out was a single printed still frame. It was the cedar tree. It was that first afternoon, the light going copper. It was Adrian Kovar with his hand flat on the back of a sleeping 5-year-old in a yellow dress, and Maren Cole sitting on the edge of the bench beside them, with her body turned toward her daughter. It had been taken from behind the garden wall. Maren's hands went cold before her mind caught up. She turned it over. There were 7 words on the back, in handwriting she had spent 4 years learning to read the mood of from across a room. "Beautiful. You owe me an explanation, Maren." Maren didn't scream. She had learned a long time ago that screaming was the one luxury a woman in her position could never afford, because screaming brought people, and people asked questions, and questions ended with someone saying, "Maybe you should sit down and tell us the whole story from the beginning." So she stood in the linen room with a photograph in her hand, and her whole body going numb from the feet up, and she counted. She got to 11 before her mind came back online, And when it did not come back with fear. It came back with logistics. That was what 8 months had done to her. Fear was for the first city. By the fourth, fear had been ground down into something more efficient and much colder a list. The car was in the north lot. The tank was 3/4. There was $240 in the coffee tin now because she'd been paid twice in this house already. Ivy's shoes were by the door of the small room. The rabbit was on the bed. Everything else was replaceable, and she had already replaced everything else 3 times. 90 minutes, she thought. She could be gone in 90 minutes and 400 miles away by morning. And then she thought about Ivy on the drawing room floor with the blocks, and Adrian on his knees in a suit that probably cost more than the car, and her hand closed around the photograph hard enough to crease it. She sat down on a laundry hamper because her legs weren't holding anymore. The postmark. She looked for it, and there wasn't one. No stamp, no address, no name. That meant it had not gone through any mail system at all. It meant somebody had put it into a household post pile inside a house with 40 armed men and a wall around it, and the only way that happened was if someone in this house had carried it in. That was the thought that finally made her hands shake. She stood up, folded the photograph in half, and put it in the front pocket of her apron and walked out of the linen room with her face completely calm, because that too was a skill she had, and she went to find her daughter. Ivy was in the kitchen negotiating with Teresa over the number of cookies that constituted a reasonable afternoon. Maren stood in the doorway and looked at the back of her daughter's head, at the black bow tied crooked, because Ivy tied it herself now and refused all assistance, and she felt the whole plan she'd built in the linen room come apart in about 4 seconds, because there was one problem with the list. For the first time since March, Ivy had a room. Not a backseat, not a motel, not a corner of a studio behind a sheet on a string. A room with a window seat which she had chosen herself and blocks by the window, and a man who read to her badly every night and let her correct him. Ivy had started singing again. Maren had not noticed when it stopped. That was the part that gutted her. Somewhere between the second city and the third, her daughter had stopped singing to herself, and Maren had been so busy staying alive that she hadn't registered the absence until it came back. She could not put that child in a car tonight. Mama Teresa says 4 is too many, but I said 3 is a baby number. 3 is a fine number, Maren heard herself say. You're not even listening. I'm listening. Ivy turned around and looked at her, and Maren watched the exact moment her 5-year-old scanned her face and found something on it, because Ivy had an instrument too, and hers had been calibrated in the same house Maren's had. Are we going, Ivy asked. Teresa's spoon stopped moving. Maren crouched down. She got her hands on her daughter's arms and she said no, and she made it true with her whole body the way you have to when you're lying to a child who has learned to check. Promise. I promise. Ivy searched her face for another second and then accepted it and turned back to Teresa and said 4, in a tone that made clear the negotiation had entered a new phase. Teresa gave her 4. Teresa also, without looking at Maren, said quietly, the linen room's got a bad door. Sticks. If you're going to stand in there being upset, use the pantry. It's got no window. Maren looked up at her. Teresa still didn't look back. She was scrubbing a pot that was already clean. 19 years, she said. I've watched a lot of women go pale in this house. You want my advice, you tell him you don't hold a thing like that by yourself here. This isn't the kind of place where holding things by yourself works out. Tell him what, Maren said. I don't even know what it is. You know exactly what it is, Teresa said. That's why you've gone the color of that wall. She didn't tell him that night. She told herself it was because he came home late. He did 10:15, she heard the gate, and because he went straight to his study and stayed there, and because you didn't knock on that door. All of that was true, and none of it was the reason. The reason was that if she told him, he would know that Wade had found her, and a man who knew Wade had found her had a very simple, very reasonable option available to him, which was to make the problem leave the property. Silas Renner had already said as much. Maren didn't know that, but she didn't need to. She'd worked in enough houses to know how the calculation went. You don't keep a liability because the liability's daughter is charming. So she said nothing, and she lay awake in a room that smelled like roses, listening for a car on the road, and around 2 in the morning, she got up and went down to the kitchen for water she didn't want, and Adrian Kovar was sitting at the small staff table in the dark with his tie off and his sleeves pushed up and a glass of something in front of him he hadn't touched. They looked at each other. "I'll go," she said. "Sit down." She sat, not on the edge this time, somewhere between the edge and the middle, which she noticed herself doing and did not have the energy to correct. "You don't sleep," he said. It wasn't a question. "I sleep. You've been up past 5 nights out of the last 8. There's a camera on the east corridor." Marin's stomach turned over. "You watch the corridor?" "I watch everything," Adrian said without any apology at all. "That's the job. I stopped watching that one on the 4th night because a 5-year-old kept walking past it at 11 o'clock to check that her mother was still in the room, and I decided I didn't want to be a man who watched that." Marin put her hands flat on the table. "She does that every night, 11, sometimes half past. She stands outside your door for about 20 seconds and then goes back to bed." Marin had not known. She had genuinely not known. And something about that, the sheer number of nights her daughter had been checking that she hadn't been left quietly alone without ever mentioning it, hit her harder than the photograph had. "I never wanted her to be like that," she said. "Like what?" "Like me." Adrian turned the glass a quarter turn on the table and didn't drink it. "You want a real answer or a kind one?" "Real." "She's not like you," he said. "She's what you were before. That's not the same thing, and it's not gone yet, and you've got maybe 2 more years to decide whether it stays." Marin stared at him. "That's a horrible thing to say." "You asked for real. It's still horrible." "Yes," Adrian agreed, and something in his face moved that might on another man have been the beginning of an apology, and on him was just a small acknowledgement that he had in fact been horrible. And Marin sleep, starved, terrified, 12 days into a house she didn't understand, with a photograph folded in her apron upstairs, laughed. It surprised her badly. It came out of her before she could stop it, and it was a real laugh, short and startled, and she put her hand over her mouth like she'd broken something. Adrian looked at her for a moment. Then he got up, found the kettle, and made her tea without asking whether she wanted any, and set it down in front of her with the same brisk efficiency he brought to everything else on earth. That was the night it started. It became a thing neither of them named, which is how all true things start. Some nights it was 8 minutes, what Ivy had done that day, whether the roses needed cutting back. Nothing at all. Other nights it went past 1 past 2, the two of them talking in the low voices people use when a house is asleep around them. He told her about his father in pieces over 3 separate nights and never in order. That the man had run Holloway Bay's waterfront for 26 years and had never once raised his voice either. Adrian said it flatly like a diagnosis. That he had taken a 9-year-old Adrian out to the cedar tree the day his dog died and explained to him kindly, patiently, that the crying was a design flaw and could be corrected with practice. "And was it?" Marin asked. "Yes. That's the part that's wrong with you. That's one of the parts." She told him things she had never told the agency or the last 3 employers who had asked nothing and been given nothing, small things mostly. That she'd wanted to be a dental hygienist and had 2 semesters done. What Ivy had been like as a newborn, furious mainly and loud and awake at all the wrong hours. The apartment before this one, which had a radiator that banged, and how for 6 weeks she had woken up at every bang, thinking it was a fist on the door, until one night she didn't and had cried in the bathroom about that for an hour because she'd finally relaxed somewhere she was going to have to leave. There was a night in the 3rd week when it nearly ended before it was anything. She had told him about the report, not the version from the bench, the whole version. The officer's name, the card he gave her, the 2 follow-up calls. And then because she was tired and because it was after one, she told him the part she had never said aloud to another human being, that when she finally understood the report was going nowhere, her first feeling had not been rage. It had been relief. Because if the system was never going to work, she said, then it wasn't my fault it hadn't worked. I hadn't done it wrong. I hadn't waited too long or said it too quietly or worn the wrong thing to the station. It was just never going to work. She was staring at the table. And I have hated myself for that ever since, because a person should be angry, and I was just relieved. Adrian said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I've had 3 men killed." Marin's head came up. "You asked me once what I do. You've never asked twice, and I've been waiting for it." He said it exactly the way he said everything, flat, unhurried, without any performance of guilt at all. 2 of them had it coming by any measure you'd recognize. One of them I'm not sure about anymore. I was 29. I've never once lost sleep about the first two, and I lose sleep about the third maybe 4 times a year. And the reason I'm telling you at 1 in the morning is that you're sitting in my kitchen at 1 in the morning and you should have all the information. The tea had gone cold between her hands. Why are you telling me this? Because you're going to find out eventually, Adrian said, and I would rather you decided to leave over the truth than over a rumor. Maren stood up. She got as far as the doorway. She stood there with her back to him for 11 full seconds, and she thought about a car with 3/4 of a tank and $240 in a coffee tin, and she thought about her daughter's crooked black bow, and she thought about the fact that the man behind her had just voluntarily handed a frightened woman the single worst thing about himself at 1 in the morning, which was not a thing that any man in her life had ever done, including the ones who had never hurt anybody. She turned around and sat back down. Then you should know something too, she said, and she took the photograph out of her apron pocket and put it on the table between them. Adrian did not pick it up right away. He looked at it for a long time. Then he turned it over, read the 7 words, and turned it back, and Maren watched something happen in his face that she would not be able to describe afterward, except to say that the man who had been in that kitchen a second ago left and something else sat down. When? 10 days ago. 10 days? I couldn't, she said, and her voice broke on it. I couldn't because if you knew he'd found me, you'd have to do the sensible thing. And the sensible thing is putting us in a car, and I've been in the car, and I can't put her back in the car. Maren. She has a room. She picked it herself. She sings now. Maren, she stopped. You've been walking around this house for 10 days knowing someone got inside the perimeter, Adrian said, and you thought the risk was that I'd evict you. She didn't answer. He put the photograph down. He was very, very still. Where did it come from? The household post, Teresa's stack on the counter, no stamp, no postmark. She watched him understand it in real time, the same conclusion she'd reached in the linen room arriving at him 3 seconds faster. Somebody carried it in, he said. Yes, Adrian stood up. She thought he was going to leave, go straight to Marco, tear the house apart at 2 in the morning. Instead, he stood there with one hand on the back of the chair and did not move for maybe 5 seconds. And Maren realized with a small shock that he was making himself calm down. Deliberately, the way you'd unclench a fist finger by finger. He wrote you owe me an explanation, he said finally. Yes. Not I'm coming. Not give her back. He wrote you owe me. Adrian's voice had gone strange. That's not a threat. That's a man who thinks the conversation's still open. It's never been open. He doesn't know that. Adrian looked at her. That's worse, and I need you to understand why it's worse. A man who's angry at you will eventually get tired. A man who thinks you're still his and just temporarily confused doesn't get tired. He gets patient. He waits 4 cities. Maren's hands were shaking again. She pressed them flat. So what happens now? Now nothing happens, Adrian said. Now you go to bed and you do exactly what you did yesterday and tomorrow and the day after. You don't change one single thing about how you move through this house. Why pasa? Because somebody in here handed that envelope to Teresa, he said. And the second you start looking over your shoulder, they'll know we found it. I went to Marco Duarte at 6 in the morning and did not come out of the security office for 4 hours. Marco was the only man Adrian had ever kept who was willing to say, I'm not sure yet out loud, which was the entire reason he'd kept him. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, took the photograph in gloved hands, looked at the angle of it, and said, the first useful thing anybody had said in 2 weeks. This wasn't a phone through a gap in the wall, he said. Look at the framing. Whoever took it had time. They were set up. They were comfortable. How long? To get that angle with that light, they'd been out there before. Multiple days. Marco set it down. Boss, the wall runs the length of the West Line. There's 4 dead zones on it, and I know where all 4 are because I mapped them in April. Whoever sat in one of them knew which one to sit in. The room got very quiet. Say the rest, Adrian said. You already know the rest. Say it. Marco put both hands on the desk. The exterior camera map isn't public. 9 people have it. I'm one. You're one. He paused. Silas is one. Silas hired you. I'm aware. Silas carried me out of a building when I was 22. I'm aware of that too, Marco said. And I'd like the record to show I hate this conversation and I'm not accusing him of anything. I'm telling you that 400 people could have taken a photo of that garden and 9 could have taken that photo and I'm going to keep pulling until it's 8. Adrian looked at the photograph, at his own hand on a child's back. Pull the manifest too, he said. Marco's head came up. The harbor manifest, why? Because if somebody in this house is selling me, Adrian said, they didn't start with a photograph. That was the week Adrian taught Ivy the game. He did it on a Tuesday in the drawing room on the floor, and he framed it as a competition because that was the only framework a 5-year-old would accept. I want to teach you something, he said. It's a game. It's called 10. Is it a good game? It's a boring game, but you're going to be extremely good at it, and nobody else in this house is your mom. That got her. Ivy sat up straight. Here's how it works. If you're ever scared, really scared, not spider scared, I'm not scared of spiders. If you're ever really scared, Adrian went on, you don't shout, you don't run to find me, you don't call for your mother. Ivy's face went instantly suspicious. That's a stupid game. Listen, you do 3 things in order, and I'm going to make you say them back to me until you're sick of it. He held up a finger. 1. You count to 10 in your head, not out loud. 10 all the way, no skipping, because 10 seconds is exactly long enough for your brain to start working again. 2. 2. You find a door with a red light on it. Ivy frowned. There's red lights on the doors. There's red lights on the ones that matter. He held up a 3rd finger. 3. You get low, under something behind the something, the lowest place there is. And you stay there, and you don't come out for anybody, and you don't come out for me until you hear me say your whole name. Ivy Elizabeth Cole, not Ivy, the whole thing. She stared at him. Adrian had run this conversation through his own head 11 times before having it, and there was no version of it that didn't cost something. He watched her work through it. He watched a 5-year-old understand at some level below language that a grown man does not build a boring game with 3 rules for no reason. Why, she said. And he was ready with a light, and he did not use it. Because I need to know you'll be all right, he said, on a day when I'm not fast enough. Ivy was quiet for a second. Then she said, okay, and made him say the 3 rules 11 more times over the next 4 days. Because she had decided it was her game now, and she was going to beat him at it. It was 2 nights later that he gave her the watch. He hadn't planned it either. The book was finished, and she was fighting sleep the way she always did, and he reached into his jacket for no reason at all, and his hand found the pocket watch, the one he touched every morning without deciding, to the one that had been in his family for 3 generations, and had stopped running in '98, and had never been repaired because his father had liked it stopped. He turned it over once, then he put it in her hands. This was my father's, he said. It's very old and it's the only thing I have from him that I care about. I need somebody I trust to keep it safe. Ivy went completely still. She held it with both hands the way you hold a bird and ran one finger along the worn hinge and looked up at him with an expression of such total crushing seriousness that Adrian felt something in his chest go sideways. I'll keep it safe, she said. I'll keep it safe forever, even when I'm old. I know you will. She put it under her pillow next to the one-eared rabbit. She was asleep in 4 minutes. Adrian sat on the edge of the bed for 11 more watching a small back rise and fall and told himself on the way down the hallway that it was only a keepsake, a thing to make a child feel important. Nothing more than that. I was 38 years old, and he had never once lied to himself and gotten away with it, and he didn't get away with it that night either. Wade Trask called the preschool on a Thursday. Marin found out on Friday from the office administrator in the most ordinary voice in the world. Oh, and your brother called about Ivy's pickup schedule. We told him we can't give that out over the phone, but I said you'd probably call him back. Marin stood in the hallway of a preschool with her hand on the wall. What brother? She said. The administrator's face changed slowly. He said he was your brother. He knew her name. He knew her middle name. What did you tell him? Nothing. I swear it's policy. I told him he'd have to come in with ID. Did you tell him what days she comes? The woman didn't answer, and that was the answer. Marin got Ivy out of that building in 90 seconds. She got her into the car and buckled her in and drove 3 blocks and then pulled over into a supermarket lot because her hands had stopped working, and she sat there gripping the wheel while her daughter asked from the back seat in a small voice, whether she'd done something wrong. No, baby. Are we going? No. You said that before and then we went. That one landed like a knife between the ribs, and Marin pressed her forehead against the wheel and made a sound she had not made in 8 months. Then she picked up the phone and called a number she had been given on her second day and had never used, and Adrian Kovar answered on the first ring, which meant he had been carrying that phone for exactly this. He called her school, she said. He knew her middle name. He knows what days she goes. There was a pause of about 2 seconds. Where are you? Parking lot, corner of Vance and 3rd. Don't move, don't get out, lock the doors. A beat. Marin, you didn't run. She hadn't. She'd had a full tank and a highway 4 minutes away, and she had called instead, and she hadn't even noticed herself doing it until he said it out loud. No, she said. Then that's the first thing that's gone right in 8 months, Adrian said, and hung up. Bruno was there in 9 minutes. Adrian pulled Ivy out of the school that afternoon and had a teacher brought to the house instead, which took one phone call and an amount of money that would have paid Marin's salary for 2 years. And he did not discuss the amount with anybody. He also put 4 more men on the wall quietly on a rotation that ran through Marco and not through Silas, and told himself it was about Wade Trask. It was not entirely about Wade Trask, because Marco had come to him that same night with the manifests, and Marco had the particular stillness of a man who has found something he doesn't like and has already checked it twice. Small gaps, he said. Nothing that costs us. Nothing that shows up if you're not looking for it specifically. A container listed delayed that cleared 2 days early in April. A route change in May that never made the system, only the private notes. How far back? That's the part. Marco looked up. I went back 6 months because that's what you asked for. Then I got a feeling and went back further. He put a second folder on the desk. It goes back 9 years, boss. It doesn't start when you took over. It starts 18 months before your father died. Adrian did not move. You're telling me this has been running the entire time I have had this house? I'm telling you, Marco said carefully, that whoever's doing it was already doing it while your father was alive, and your father either never caught it or... He stopped. Or caught it, Adrian said, and did nothing. Neither of said anything for a while. I want a name, Adrian said. I want it fast and I want it certain, and until you have it, you don't say a word to anyone with a key to this house. Understood. Adrian looked out the window at the shape of the cedar in the dark and thought about a man standing in this room 3 weeks ago, saying somewhere well outside the operational perimeter of this house, so reasonably, so calmly, one single time, and never again. It rained the following Sunday, and the whole house was inside, and it was the best day any of them had had in years, which was exactly why what happened at the end of it landed the way it did. Ivy taught Bruno to play the game without permission because she decided he was bad at hiding. Teresa made too much of everything. Adrian came home before 4 with no meeting to point at and no explanation offered, and by 6 he was on the floor again with the block sleeves rolled, and Marin stood in the doorway with a dish towel and let herself watch for longer than was safe. At some point, Ivy fell asleep between them on the rug, the pocket watch clutched in one fist, and neither adult moved to pick her up because moving her would end it. You know they're all talking about you, Marin said quietly. They've always talked about me. Not like this. Adrian looked at his own hands. What are they saying? That you're soft now. She said it plainly. Bruno says it like it's a good thing. The others don't. Bruno's an idiot. Bruno carried her rabbit under his arm like it was made of glass. Adrian didn't answer that. Does it hurt you? Marin asked, them thinking it. And he told the truth, which he was doing more and more, and which was becoming a habit he no longer bothered to be alarmed by. 6 weeks ago it would have, he said. Now the only thing that frightens me is that they're right. She looked over at him. Why is that frightening? Because everything I have, Adrian said. I hold because people believe I'm not the kind of man who'd get on the floor. And the day they stop believing that the wall around this house is just a wall. Marin didn't have an answer for that. She thought about it later, though. She thought about it for a long time afterward, how he'd said it out loud in a room with an open door on a Sunday with a child asleep between them. The envelope came on Monday, not the household post this time. It was under the windshield wiper of Marin's car in the north lot inside the wall, 40 feet from a guard post, and Bruno found it at 7:10 in the morning and went white and did not touch it. There was no photograph inside. There was no letter. there was a child's black hair bow. It was not Ivy's. Ivy's was upstairs, tied crooked on her head at the breakfast table, and when Marin came running to check, Ivy looked up from her toast with the bow perfectly in place and said, "What?" It was the same bow, same ribbon, same size, same everything, bought new from a shop somewhere, and it had been left on the windshield of a locked car inside a walled property with 40 armed men on it. Marco found the dead zone on the north wall an hour later. It was 7 feet of it, and it was not on any map he'd ever made. It had been added. He stood there with a tablet in his hand and the schematic open, and he checked the file's edit history, the way he'd been checking everything for 3 weeks now, and he found the timestamp of the modification, and then he found the credential that had made it. Marco stood very still for a long moment. Then he took the stairs, 2 at a time, and walked into Adrian's study without knocking for the first time in 11 years and set the tablet down on the desk and said one sentence. "It's Silas." Marco had the blueprints for D12 in 19 minutes, and the first thing he said when he laid them out was the last thing Adrian wanted to hear. He picked it because there's no way to cover you. "I know." "No, boss, listen. There's 4 approaches, and every one of them is open ground for 140 feet. There's no roof access from the water side. There's a catwalk, but it's welded shut since the yard closed. I've got a man there right now confirming it." Marco pressed both hands flat on the paper. "He didn't pick a building. He picked a room with your name on it. He wrote our protocols. He wrote all of them." Adrian looked at the drawing for a long moment. "Then we don't use one," he said. 22 men were in the yard by 11, and every single one of them had been chosen in the previous 40 minutes by Marco personally on one criterion: hired after April of the year. Silas edited the schematic or never once assigned to a rotation Silas built. It left them thin. It left them with 2 men who had never worked a night like this in their lives. It also meant that whatever Silas knew about the way Adrian Kovar came into a building, it was 9 years out of date by the time it mattered. "You go in at midnight, and you go in clean," Marco said. "No wire, he'll check. No second phone, he'll check that too. And boss, say it. If you sign, we lose everything. Not some of it. The roads are the licenses, and the licenses are the contracts. And the contracts are why 40 men take your calls. You sign that, and by Friday, you're a man with a house." Adrian was already putting on his coat. "Marco," he said, "I've had the harbor for 9 years, and it never once got out of a car and asked to borrow my shoulder. I went in through the north door alone at 11:58, and it was the first time in his adult life he had walked into a room without a plan he trusted. He'd left his watch in the car, the silver one, the one on his wrist, because Silas knew he wore it, and Silas would take it, and Adrian was not going to stand there and let that man take anything else off him. The pocket watch he'd left with Ivy, she'd insisted on it. She'd held it up to him at the door with both hands and said, "You can't have it, it's my job," and he had almost not been able to leave the house. Silas was standing under the one working light with his hands folded in front of him, exactly the way he stood every morning at 7 when he read out the schedule. Marin was 30 feet behind him, sitting on a pallet wrist bound in front of her, and she was upright and her eyes were open, and she found Adrian's face the instant he came through the door. He cataloged her in half a second: bruise on the left forearm, dark, already ugly. Nothing on her face. Nothing on her hands. Her feet were flat on the floor and her shoulders were down, and she was not shaking. She gave him the smallest shake of her head. "I'm all right." Something in Adrian's chest unlocked exactly one notch, which was all he needed. There were 5 other men in that building, 2 Solari professional weapons down and hands loose, watching Adrian come across the floor with the particular carefulness of men who had heard stories their whole careers and were discovering in real time how much of it was accurate. 2 more at the roll doors, and Wade Trask near the pallet, standing much too close to Marin. That was wrong. Adrian saw it in the first 3 seconds, and it changed everything he thought he was walking into. Wade wasn't posted. He wasn't covering an exit. He was hovering, and the 2 Solari men kept glancing at him the way you glance at a dog you've been told is friendly. Silas had brought a man to this room who wasn't under anybody's control, and Silas knew it, and Silas had done it anyway because he'd needed somebody who knew which bedroom Marin slept in. "You came alone," Silas said. "I'm almost disappointed. I half expected you to be smarter." "I am smarter. You brought 22 men into a yard with 4 open approaches. That's not smart, that's sentimental." Silas smiled slightly. I counted them coming in. You gave me the number when you tried to hide it. 12 years, Adrian said. 12 years. You were with them before you were with us. That's not turning. That's not being bought. There was never a day you were mine. No, Silas agreed easily. There wasn't. And I want you to understand that I still liked you, Adrian, and both of those things have been true the entire time. And the fact that you can't hold them together in your head at once is exactly why your father was better at this than you. Adrian didn't answer that because the answer would have cost him something and because he'd already seen the folder on the crate. Show me. Silas gestured. One of the Solari men brought it over and set it down on the crate between them and opened it, and it was all there. The transfer instruments for the harbor licenses, the route assignments, the Halloway Bay contracts. Prepared properly. Prepared by somebody who understood the paperwork intimately, which Silas did because he'd carried it in a leather folder every morning for 12 years. Adrian looked at the top page for a long time. I thought about his father, who had built it, and about the men in the yard whose mortgages ran through it, and about the fact that in 9 years he had never once made a decision that cost him leverage. Then he thought about a woman on a pallet with a bruise on her arm. Pen, he said. Silas actually paused. It was half a second, no more, but Adrian caught it, and he understood the shape of that half second immediately as Silas had expected an argument. Silas had built a whole evening around a negotiation, around leverage, around walking a proud man down, step by step until he broke, and the proud man had asked for a pen inside 90 seconds. You don't want to read it? No, that's not like you. No, Adrian said, it isn't. He signed the first page. He signed the second and the third, and he did it steadily, and the only person in that building who understood what was actually happening was Marin Cole, 30 feet away, who watched a man hand over everything he had ever owned in the time it took to write his name 11 times, and who put her bound hands over her mouth and made no sound at all. Adrian, don't. It's already done, he said without looking up. That's your whole life. No, he said, it's a harbor. What? He signed the last page and turned the folder around and slid it across the crate, and then he stepped back and put his hands at his sides. She walks out that door, he said. Now, not after, now. Of course, Silas gestured, and one of the Solari men crossed toward the pallets to cut the ties, and for exactly 2 seconds, it looked like the whole thing was going to end the way a business transaction ends. Then Wade Trask said, no. Everybody in the building turned. No, Wade said again, and his voice had gone up. That's not what you told me. You said I get her back. You said the deal was you take the docks and I take my family. You'll get what you're owed, Silas said, in exactly the voice he'd used to tell a groundskeeper the hedges needed doing. That's not what you said. Trask, you said she'd be in the car with me. And Adrian Kovar, who had spent 9 years reading the exact instant a room stops being controllable, watched it happen from 6 feet away. Silas turned his head toward Wade. It was a small movement. It was for a man like Silas an enormous mistake because he was a person who had never in his life had to manage somebody who wasn't reasonable, and he had spent 9 years learning Adrian's protocols and about 90 minutes learning Wade Trask's. Wade had Marin by the arm and off the pallet before either Solari man moved. Trask, nobody touches her, but me, that's the whole point. That's the whole thing I said from the... Marin twisted and got her bound hands up and hit him in the throat with the flat of both wrists. It wasn't trained. It wasn't clean. It was 8 months of parking lots and motel chains and a bow on a windshield, and it landed exactly where it needed to. And Wade Trask made a sound like a door and let go of her arm. And in the 2 seconds of noise that bought, Adrian moved. So, I went for Silas. Not for a weapon, not for cover, not for the door. Straight across 6 feet of concrete at a 51-year-old man who had spent 12 years believing that Adrian Kovar would always in the end do the calculated thing. It was the last thing Silas Renner ever got wrong about him. The first shot came from the yard at the same instant because Marco had been listening to a room he couldn't see and had been waiting on exactly one signal movement, and 22 men came in through 3 approaches at once, and the whole building went to noise. Adrian took Silas off his feet and into the crate. The folder went everywhere. 9 years of contracts and a harbor and everything his father had built spilled across a warehouse floor and got walked on by men who never noticed which was Adrian would think much later exactly what they'd always been worth. Silas got a hand free and got it into Adrian's face and drove a thumb toward his eye. 12 years of standing politely with his hands folded, and there was still all of that in him. Still fast, and Adrian took it on the cheekbone and hit him twice, and heard something go. "Where's the boat?" Adrian said. Silas laughed. "There was blood in it." "You think I have a boat?" "Where's the boat, Silas?" "You signed," Silas said with his mouth full of blood and his voice still unbelievably level. "You signed. 9 years and a housekeeper's kid puts her face on your shirt, and you hand me a harbor in 90 seconds. Your father would have let her die on that pallet, and you know it. You know it." "I know it," Adrian said. And then he hit him again, and Silas Renner stopped talking, and Adrian never afterward remembered making the decision to do it a third time. Blam. I didn't see the fourth man. He was on the floor with Silas, and his whole world had narrowed to 12 inches of concrete. And the second Solari man, the one who had been at the roll door, the one nobody had got into, yet came up the gap between two container stacks, with a clean angle at Adrian's back and 11 feet of open floor between them. Marin saw it. She was 30 feet away with her wrists still bound, and she was running the wrong direction toward the noise, not away from it. And she saw the angle, and she saw where it pointed, and she did not calculate anything at all. She had run from 4 cities. She had run from a kitchen with a man making coffee in it. She had run so many times that running was no longer a decision she made. It was a thing her body did before her mind arrived, and every single one of those times she had been running away. She closed 11 feet and put herself in it. The impact spun her sideways into Adrian half a second before the sound of it reached him. He caught her. He didn't know he was doing it. He felt her go rigid against his chest and felt his own hand come up and find her back and find warmth spreading fast underneath it, and the entire warehouse, the noise, the men, Silas on the floor, the papers, all of it simply stopped existing. Marin, her name came out of him in a shape he didn't recognize. "Marin, Marin, look at me, look at me." Her eyes found his, glassy, going wide, fighting to hold on to him. One hand came up and closed in the front of his shirt in exactly the way her daughters had under a tree in August, in a life that suddenly felt 400 years away. "Ivy," she said, "she's safe. She's at the house, she's safe, she did the game, she did all the 3. She's sitting in the kitchen holding my father's watch, and she's fine." Marin's mouth moved. Nothing came out. "Stay with me, Marin. Stay with me." He got his hand over the wound and pressed, and she made a sound that took 10 years off him, and he was shouting for Marco, for a medic, for anyone. And somewhere behind him, the last of the gunfire went ragged, and then stopped. And none of it mattered. None of it registered, not the harbor on the floor, not the men, not Silas. Only the woman in his arms, and the fact that she was still breathing, and the narrowing, unbearable certainty that he had spent 38 years being extremely careful about exactly this, and it had happened anyway. Wade Trask ran. He got as far as the roll door on the water side, and one of Marco's men put him on the ground, and he lay there on the concrete shouting that he was the father, that he had rights, that he'd been promised, and nobody in that building answered him, and he was still saying it 40 minutes later in the back of a car with his hands behind him. That was the whole of it in the end. That was what he had been, a man who was owed something, standing at the edge of other people's violence, certain the arrangement had been made with him in mind. Silas Renner did not run. He was found where Adrian had left him, and he was breathing when the ambulance took him, and he stopped being anyone's problem at 4:15 that morning in a hospital 9 miles away, with a police officer outside the door, and no boat and no harbor, and nobody who came. Adrian, when Marco told him, felt nothing whatsoever. That was the thing he hadn't expected. He'd spent an hour in the back of a car with Marin's blood dried on both hands, imagining what he would feel, and what he felt when the news came was a kind of tired, distant nothing, because it changed absolutely none of the only thing he cared about. The first 12 hours were a corridor and a chair. He would never afterward remember the details clearly. He remembered a surgeon at 2:10 using the words "close and fortunate," and the next few hours matter, and he remembered absorbing it, the way he absorbed everything still and flat and giving nothing away, and he remembered the surgeon leaving. He remembered Marco finding him 20 minutes later in a stairwell with his forehead against the cinder block wall and both hands braced on either side of it. Neither of them ever mentioned it again. Teresa brought Ivy at 6 in the morning because Ivy had not slept and would not sleep and had informed the entire household with total calm that she was going to see her mother, and there was not a single adult at Ashgrove willing to be the one to tell her no. She came down that corridor at a run. Adrian caught her before she got to the door. He got down on one knee, which put him below her eye line, and he held both her arms, and he made himself say it properly because she had earned it properly. Your mother got hurt. Ivy's face did something he never forgot. Is she dead? No, are you lying? I have never lied to you, and I'm not starting today. She got hurt very badly, and the doctors fixed her. And she's asleep, and she's going to be asleep for a while, and you can sit with her the whole time. Ivy considered this. Then she said, did I do it right? And Adrian, who had been holding himself together for 9 hours on nothing at all, felt the whole structure of it shift. Did you do what right? The game. Her chin had started to go. You said count and find the red door and get low and don't come out for anybody. And I did all three, but she got hurt anyway, so maybe I did it wrong. Maybe if Ivy Elizabeth Cole. She stopped. You did it perfectly, Adrian said. You did it better than any grown man in my house has ever done anything. 2 men walked past you and you didn't move. Your mother is alive because she knew exactly where you were and she didn't have to look for you. Do you understand me? She could do what she did because you did what you did. Ivy's mouth was shaking. Then can I go in? Yes. She went in. She climbed into the chair by the bed without being lifted, and she took out the pocket watch. She'd had it in her fist the entire night in the car, through the corridor, and she put it on the blanket next to her mother's hand. I kept it safe, she said. Maren didn't wake up for another 9 hours. But that was the moment, the nurses said afterward, when everything on the monitors settled, the small stopped watch on the blanket, and a 5-year-old's hand on top of it, and none of them could explain it, and none of them tried very hard to. Maren surfaced a little after 3 in the afternoon. Adrian was in the chair. He hadn't left it except twice, and both times only far enough to stand in the doorway, where he could still see the bed. Ivy was asleep across his lap, with her legs hanging off one side. Maren's eyes opened. It took her a while to find him. Hi, she said. It came out as almost nothing. Adrian didn't trust himself to answer for a second. Hi. She's on my lap. She's been here since 6 this morning. She has not let go of that watch once. Maren turned her head very slowly and saw her daughter, and her whole face came apart. Don't, Adrian said. Don't cry, it's going to hurt you. I'm allowed. You're allowed. She cried for a while quietly, badly, and Adrian sat there with a sleeping child on him and did not know what to do with any of it, so he just put his hand on the bed next to hers and left it there. When she could talk again, she said, You signed it. Yes. All of it. All of it. Adrian. Maren, you're gonna shall walking by water me. You don't get to lecture me about bad financial decisions. She laughed and then made a noise that meant laughing was a mistake. Why, she said when she could, and don't be clever. Why did you sign it in 90 seconds? And he told her the truth because that had become a habit he no longer bothered to be alarmed by. Because when I was 9, Adrian said, my father took me out to that tree and told me that crying was a design flaw. And I believed him. And for 29 years, I built everything I have on the idea that the thing you protect is the thing that makes you strong. He was looking at his own hands. And then a kid asked to borrow my shoulder. Maren didn't say anything. Silas told me my father would have let you die on that pallet, he said. And he was right. That's the part I can't get past. He was completely right, and I stood there in a warehouse, understanding that the only reason I'm not that man is that a 5-year-old with a crooked bow walked into my garden 4 months ago. That's not the only reason. It's the reason it happened this year. Maren looked at him for a long moment. Her hand moved about 2 inches across the blanket and found his and stayed there. You lost everything, she said. I lost a harbor. You lost 40 men in 9 years, and your father's whole. Maren, he said, there is a stopped watch on your blanket that hasn't told the time since 1998, and it's the only thing in my life I ever managed to hold on to, and it's still in one piece because a 5-year-old carried it through a hallway with a man lying in it. So you'll excuse me if I've stopped being sentimental about the docks. She was quiet for a while. She really didn't come out, she said. 2 men walked past her, one of them close enough to touch. Oh, God. She told me you looked away from her on purpose, in the room, So they wouldn't follow your eyes. Adrian's voice went strange. She's 5, Marin. She watched you do that and she understood exactly what you were doing, and she never said a word about it until after. Marin closed her eyes. I've spent 8 months, she said, thinking the only useful thing I ever did for her was drive. You did the other thing too. What other thing? You stopped, Adrian said. You had a full tank and 4 minutes to a highway, and you called me instead. That's the day it turned, not the warehouse. That. So, the harbor was gone by Friday exactly as Marco had said it would be. There was no getting it back. Adrian had signed instruments that were valid the moment they were executed, and the fact that the man he'd handed them to had died at 4:15 the following morning changed nothing about their existence. There were entities behind Silas, there always had been, and the Solari organization took possession of 9 years of Kovar routes without ever having to fire another round. Marco laid it out on the hospital cafeteria table on the 4th day. You've got the house, he said. You've got the yard on Farrick Street, the small one, which is a repair shop and 11 employees and about as much annual income as you used to spend on cars. You've got some property. That's it. And the men, 14, have already gone over. 6 are waiting to see. 2 came to me and asked if you were all right, which is more than I expected. Marco hesitated. Bruno's out of the ICU. First thing he asked was whether the kid was okay. Second thing he asked was whether he still had a job, and, boss, I didn't know what to tell him. Adrian turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table. Tell him yes, he said. With what money? I'll find the money. Marco leaned back and looked at him for a long moment, and something in his face that had been braced for 4 days finally let go. You know what the strangest part of this is, he said. I've been waiting since Tuesday for you to look like a man who lost. And you don't. You look like a man who paid for something. That's what I did, Adrian said. Marin came home 11 days later, thinner, moving carefully on Teresa's arm and refusing a wheelchair the entire length of the drive. The East Wing had gone cold and wrong in her absence. Ivy had refused to sleep in it and had spent 9 nights in the armchair in Adrian's study, which he had allowed on the first night and then simply stopped pretending to argue about, and it filled back up within about an hour of Marin's return. Blocks on the rug, the one-eared rabbit reinstated at the head of the bed. A small, relentless voice narrating every detail of her mother's recovery to anyone who came within range, whether they had asked for the update or not. Adrian did not go back to who he'd been. He tried for about 4 days out of pure habit, the ledgers, the early mornings, the careful stillness, and found that it simply didn't fit anymore, the way a coat doesn't fit. He came home early now, with no reason offered to anybody. He read the bedtime books most nights, badly, including the ones where his voice cracked halfway through The Wolf, and nobody in that house pretended not to notice. And nobody said a word about it either. It was on the 18th night, with Marin asleep down the hall, and the house quiet, that Ivy sat up in bed and held out the pocket watch to him with both hands. You can have it back now. Adrian looked at it. I gave it to you. I know, but the job's done. She said it very seriously, the way she said everything. You said you needed somebody you trust to keep it safe, and I kept it safe in Mama's home. So it's done. He took it. He turned it over once in his hand, feeling the hinge she'd worn slightly looser over 4 months of small, careful fingers. And he thought about the fact that he had given it to her that first week as a keepsake, as a thing to make a child feel important, and had told himself a lie about it on the way down the hallway and not gotten away with it. Ivy. What? I'm going to keep this for a while, he said, but I'm going to need it back from you eventually, for something else. Ivy narrowed her eyes. What's something else? Ask me in the spring, Adrian said. The video up on a Tuesday morning in late November, and by noon it had been watched 40,000 times. Marco found it first. He came into the study with his laptop already open and set it down without a word, and Adrian looked at the screen and saw himself. 41 seconds, shot from behind the west wall in August in copper light. A man sitting on an iron bench with his arms suspended 2 inches above the back of a sleeping child, not able to put it down. And then at 19 seconds in putting it down, the account that posted it had been created 11 days earlier. The caption was 6 words, Holloway Bay's monster. Somebody wake him up. It's Solari, Marco said. It has to be. They've had that file since August, and they sat on it, and now they've got the harbor, and they're finishing the job. They want the last 20 men to see it. Adrian watched it through twice. Do we take it down? You can't take anything down. It's on 4 other accounts already. Then let it run. Marco's head came up. Boss, Marco, they think they're humiliating me, Adrian said. They're showing 400,000 people that I put my hand on a child's back. Let them. By Thursday, it was 200,000. By the following Monday, it was 1.5 million, and it had escaped Holloway Bay entirely and gone somewhere nobody could steer it. And the thing about the video, the thing the Solari organization had not once considered because they were men who had only ever thought about it as a weapon, was that nobody who watched it saw a monster going soft. They saw a man who did not know what to do with his hands. The comments were not what anybody expected. They were from women in Ohio and truck drivers in Nevada and a nurse in Manchester who wrote that she'd watched it 14 times and couldn't say why. Somebody clipped the 19th second and slowed it down. Somebody else put it next to a photograph of Adrian Kovar from 4 years earlier, coming out of a courthouse. And the difference between the two faces got shared more than the original. It ruined him exactly as intended. 6 of the 8 men who had been waiting to see went over in the first week because a man who could be filmed like that could not hold a room. And everybody in that business understood it instantly. And Adrian, sitting in a study with a laptop showing a number that had passed 2 million, discovered something that genuinely surprised him. He did not care. He tried to care. He went looking for it, the old feeling, the thing that used to arrive when a competitor gained an inch, the tightening that had run his life since he was 29. It wasn't there. He turned the laptop around and shut it and went downstairs, and Ivy was at the kitchen table doing something violent to a piece of paper with a marker. And she looked up and said, "You're home early again," in a tone of deep suspicion, and Adrian said, "I know." And that was the whole of it. Marin found out about the video from Teresa 4 days after everyone else, because nobody in the house had wanted to be the one to tell her. She watched it in the kitchen with the volume off. She watched the 41 seconds all the way through, and then she sat there with her hands flat on the table because the frame that had come to her in an envelope in September, the printed still that had cost her 10 days of silence and nearly put her back in a car, was the same frame. Same angle, same light. "Wade never took that photo," she said. Teresa looked up. "He couldn't have. He was 400 miles away in August. I know he was. The school call didn't come until October." Marin's voice had gone very quiet. "Silas took it, or Silas gave it to somebody who took it, and then somebody printed it and put it in my post so that I'd be terrified enough to run." "Why would they want you to run?" "Because if I ran," Marin said, "Adrian would have come after me. Out there, off the property, away from 40 men and a wall." She had to put her head down on the table for a second, because it had almost worked. She had stood in a linen room with a photograph in her hand and made a list: the car, the tank, the coffee tin, and she had gotten to 90 minutes, and the only thing that had stopped her was a window seat and the fact that her daughter had started singing again. She told Adrian that night in the kitchen at 1:30, which was still when the two of them talked. He listened without interrupting the way he did. "I know," he said. "You know, Marco worked it out in the first week. The timestamp on the file that went out of this house was 6:52 in the evening, August the 11th. Trask's phone was in Delaware." Adrian turned his glass a quarter turn on the table. "He wasn't the one who found you. He was the one who got told where you were." Marin stared at him. "You've known for 2 months." "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you'd have spent 2 months believing you brought all of this into my house," Adrian said, "and you didn't. Silas had a hole in my wall in April. You walked in August. He didn't come here because of you, Marin. He used you because you arrived." She sat back. "That's supposed to make me feel better." "It's supposed to make you stop apologizing," he said. "You've apologized to me 11 times since the hospital. I counted. You did not count. I counted. So I knew. The trial was in February, not Solari. Nobody ever touched Solari, and nobody ever would, and Adrian had made his peace with that in about the time it took Marco to explain the paperwork. The trial was Wade Trask. Marin had gone into a police station in March and filed a report and had it die quietly in a drawer 2 counties over. She had learned at 28 the most corrosive lesson a person can learn, that the machine which is supposed to catch you is not personally malicious. It is simply staffed by people, and some of those people go to their brother's house on Sundays. So when Marco told her the case was being taken seriously, she didn't believe it. She said so out loud in the study in front of Adrian and Marco, and a lawyer whose retainer she did not ask about. You don't understand how this goes, she said. I've done this. I sat in a room and I told a nice man everything, and he wrote it all down, and it was thorough, and then nothing happened, and 6 weeks later, Wade was in my kitchen making coffee. So don't tell me they're taking it seriously. They took it seriously last time too, right up until the part where they didn't. The lawyer started to say something about aggravating factors in multi-jurisdictional interest. Adrian cut across him. Marin, what? The reason it died last time is that you were the only person in the room, he said. One woman, one report, one deputy's brother. That's a story a department can lose. This time there's a hospital record, a surgical report, 4 witnesses who were in that building. Bruno's statement, a preschool administrator's call log, and a 5-year-old whose testimony nobody is going to need because we have everything else. He paused. It's not going to work because the system suddenly got fair. It's going to work because it's too expensive to make it go away. Marin looked at him. That's a horrible thing to say. You asked for real. It's still horrible. Yes, Adrian said, and they both heard the echo of a kitchen at 2 in the morning 4 months earlier, and neither of them mentioned it. She testified on the 9th of February. She was on the stand for 2 hours and 11 minutes, and it was, she said afterward, worse than the warehouse because in the warehouse, there had been no time to feel anything. And on the stand, there was nothing but time. Wade sat 18 feet away in a suit somebody had bought him and looked at her the entire time with an expression of patient, wounded confusion. And that was the thing that nearly took her apart because it was the exact expression he'd worn in her kitchen. She got through it. She got through the 4 years. She got through the night Ivy was 3, and she said out loud in a room with a stenographer in it the sentence she had never once finished. Not to a shelter coordinator, not to a police officer, not to Adrian on a bench in August. And when she was done, she looked up, and the gallery behind her was not empty. Adrian was there, Marco was there, Teresa was there in the coat she wore to funerals. Bruno was there with a cane he still needed and would need for another year, sitting in the second row with his hands on his knees. 8 people from a house that had 6 months earlier contained 40 men who did not know her name. Marin Cole stood up from the witness box and understood with total clarity what had actually been broken in her the first time. It had never been that nobody believed her. It was that she had been alone in the room. Wade Trask got 11 years. He was denied bail pending sentencing after a bail hearing in which the state introduced without comment a photograph of a child's black hair bow left under a windshield wiper. His brother, the deputy, resigned in April 1 week ahead of a state review, and the review continued anyway. Everything else, though, took much longer and was much less dramatic and was the part Adrian had not been prepared for at all. He was not a mafia boss anymore. He was a man with a house he couldn't afford to heat properly, a repair yard on Farrick Street with 11 employees and about 19 months of runway if nothing broke. He found out very quickly that he did not know how to run a business that made money slowly. The first 3 months at Farrick Street were a disaster. He came in and did what he had always done, which was give instructions and expect them executed. And by the 4th week, 2 of the 11 had quit, and the yard foreman, a 60-year-old named Ellis, who had been repairing hulls since before Adrian was born, sat him down on an upturned crate and said the single most useful sentence anybody said to him that year. Son, I don't work for you because I'm afraid of you. I work for you because it's Tuesday, and this is where the job is. You want the good version of me? You're going to have to ask. Adrian went home that night and sat in the kitchen and told Marin about it at 1:30, and Marin laughed so hard she had to hold her side where the scar was. It's not funny. It's extremely funny. He talked to me like I was 19. Adrian, she said, you have spent your entire life being obeyed by people who are counting the exits. A man just told you to say please. That's the best thing that's happened to you all year. He hired 6 more people by summer. He learned to ask. He was terrible at it for about 8 months, and then abruptly 1 week in September he wasn't, and Ellis noticed and never said a word about it, which Adrian appreciated more than praise. Bruno came back to work in June on the gate at Farrick Street, which required no cane and no running. He turned down a better-paying offer from a security firm in the city, and when Marco asked him why, he said, because the kid says hello to me every morning, and would not elaborate. Marco stayed. He never explained why either. He took a 60% pay cut and moved from head of security for a family that controlled a harbor to operations manager for a repair yard. And the only time it ever came up was a night in July when he'd had 2 beers and said apropos of nothing, "You know what I like about this? I don't have to check under my car anymore." And then went back to talking about invoices. 14 men who'd gone over to Solari in November, Adrian never heard from 11 of them again. 2 sent messages. One came back in October, stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, and asked if there was work, and Adrian gave him a broom, and he took it. Ivy started at a real school in September, and it went badly for the first 6 weeks, and this turned out to be the hardest thing any of them had to survive. She wouldn't stay in the classroom. It came out slowly the way these things do. She was fine at drop-off. She was fine until about 10:30, and then she would ask to go to the bathroom and would not come back, and they would find her in the corridor by the fire door sitting on the floor low in the corner behind it. Marin cried in the car about it twice before she let anybody see. "She's checking exits," she said to Adrian. "She's 5 and she's checking exits, and that's mine. That's from me. 4 cities in a car and 8 months of me doing it in front of her. It's not from you." "Don't." "It's from all of it," Adrian said. "It's from him, and it's from Silas, and it's from a hallway in November, and it's a little bit from me because I taught her a game with 3 rules, and she used it, and it worked. And now some part of her thinks the corner behind a door is the safest place in the world." And she's right, Marin. That's the problem. She's right, and we have to teach her out of something that saved her life. It took 8 months and a child psychologist and a great deal of money. The thing that actually worked wasn't any of that. It was Adrian on a Saturday in January sitting on the floor of Ivy's room and telling her he wanted to change the rules of the game. "You can't change it. It's my game." "I know. That's why I'm asking." Ivy folded her arms. "There's a 4th rule now," Adrian said. "Rule 4 is when it's over, you come out. Not when you hear your whole name. When it's over, and the way you know it's over is you ask somebody, and if they say it's over, then it's over, and you have to believe them. What if they're wrong? Then I'll be wrong with you." Ivy thought about that for a very long time in the way she thought about everything, which was completely and without hurry. "Is it over now?" she said. "Yes," Adrian said. "It's over now." She didn't believe him that day. She believed him in about March, gradually the way children do. And by May, she was in the classroom until 3 o'clock, like everybody else, and had a best friend named Priya and had lost all interest in the fire door. Marin kept the 4th rule. She used it on herself. She used it out loud in the kitchen more than once. "Is it over?" And Adrian said yes every single time. She asked for 2 years and never once got tired of being asked. There was a night the following winter that nearly ended everything, and neither of them ever told Ivy about it. Marin got a letter. It came through the proper channel this time, forwarded by the lawyer, from a state facility with a case number on it, and it was 11 pages long, and it was from Wade. She read the first page and a half. Then she put it down on the kitchen table and did not touch it again, and she sat there for 3 hours, and when Adrian came down at 1:30, she was still sitting there with her hands around a cup of tea gone cold. "Do you want me to read it?" "No." "Do you want me to burn it?" "No." She was staring at the table. "That's the whole problem. I don't want either of those. I've read a page and a half, and part of me," her voice cracked, "part of me is relieved he still thinks about us. Do you understand how disgusting that is? 4 years in a hospital, in 11 years in a state facility, and a piece of me lit up when I saw his handwriting, because for 8 months the only thing that made me feel real was being hunted." Adrian sat down across from her. "Yes," he said. "Yes, what?" "Yes, I understand it. You can't possibly. Marin and I spent 9 years running a harbor," he said. "And when I signed it away, I told everybody it was nothing and it was nothing, and I still went out to Farrick Street for 6 months and shouted at men who didn't deserve it because some part of me wanted to feel like I still mattered the old way. You don't get to be the only person at this table who's disgusting." "Disgusting," she laughed. It came out wet and awful. "What do I do with it?" "Nothing tonight." "That's not an answer." "It's the only real one," he said. "You don't have to have the right feeling about him by morning. You just have to not be in the car." She burned it in the yard on a Sunday 3 weeks later, with Ivy at a friend's house and Adrian standing about 10 feet away not saying anything, and she cried for about 4 minutes and then asked what was for dinner. She never opened another one. 2 more came. Both went into the fire unread, and by the fourth year, they stopped coming. She went back to school in the fall of the second year. Dental hygiene the 2 semesters she'd already had, plus 5 more at the community college on the north side, and she was 7 years older than most of the people in her cohort and the best student in it by a distance nobody found surprising once they'd met her. She graduated in the spring of the fourth year. Ivy 8 by then, taller, still tying her own bow, crooked on principle, made a sign out a poster board that said, "My mom is a dental hygienist," in letters that got progressively smaller as she ran out of room and held it up for the entire ceremony with both arms and would not sit down, and nobody in the row behind them complained even once. Adrian sat next to her in a folding chair in a gymnasium with 300 other people's families and understood somewhere during the D's that he had not thought about the harbor in over a year. He asked her in May under the cedar. He had waited longer than he needed to, and he knew it. Marco had told him so twice. Teresa had told him so with a look which was more effective. The reason he waited was simple, and he only admitted it to himself the week before he had spent 4 years being terrified that Maren Cole had stayed because she had nowhere else to go. That was the thing that sat in him. She had come to that house with $240 and a car and a child, and he had given her a room and a wall and 40 armed men, and no honest man could ask a woman a question like that, while he was also the reason she was safe. So he waited until she had a license and a car in her own name and $11,000 in an account he had nothing to do with, and a job offer from a practice on the north side that had nothing whatsoever to do with him. Then he asked. He went out to the cedar at the end of the lawn on an evening in May when the light held gold past 7, and she was already there on the same iron bench watching Ivy conduct some enormous imaginary business across the grass. "You're staring," Maren said. "I'm allowed." He sat down beside her close enough that their shoulders touched, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. "Do you remember the watch?" he said eventually. "The one you gave a 5-year-old. "Yes, Adrian, I remember the watch." She gave it back. 4 years ago, she said the job was done. "I remember that too." She was very proud of it. "She asked me what I needed it back for," Adrian said. "And I told her to ask me in the spring." Maren turned her head. He took it out of his jacket, the same worn silver case, the hinge still slightly loose from 4 months of small, careful fingers in the first year, and never repaired because he'd liked it loose, the way his father had liked it stopped. He opened it. The movement was gone. It had been taken out by a jeweler on Farrick Street who had done it for free and refused to discuss it, and in the space where 3 generations of a stopped clock had sat there was a ring. It was old, obviously clearly not bought recently. It had been in that family longer than Adrian had been alive and longer than his father had been alive. And it had spent 30 years in a drawer waiting for a man who had been raised to believe that wanting something was a design flaw. Maren went completely still. "I need to say this properly," Adrian said, "and I've written it down 4 times and thrown all 4 away, so it's going to come out badly." "Say it badly." "You walked into my house with $240 and a kid and a rule that you'd never say anything that could be repeated," he said. "And inside 11 days you'd told me the worst thing that ever happened to you, and inside a year you'd put yourself in front of a bullet that had my name on it. I have spent 5 years trying to work out what I ever gave you that was worth that, and I've got nothing. I don't have a harbor, don't have 40 men. I've got a repair yard, a house I can't heat, and a stopwatch." He held it out. "But I've been early to dinner every night for 5 years, and I've never once lied to your daughter, and if you'll let me, I'd like to make that permanent." Maren didn't answer for a second because she couldn't. Across the lawn, Ivy abandoned her imaginary business entirely at the sight of the little silver case and came sprinting back at full speed and arrived breathless at her mother's knee just in time to see her nod. Both of them crying in the particular overlapping way of people who have spent a long time waiting for something good to finally stop moving. Ivy looked at the ring with enormous professional seriousness. "Is that my job again?" she said. "Am I keeping it safe now?" Adrian laughed properly out loud, the sound still unfamiliar enough in his own chest to catch him by surprise every time, and pulled her up onto the bench between them. "No," he said, "this one we keep together." Giuseppe. They were married in September in the garden under the cedar with 51 people. Ellis came. Priya's whole family came. Bruno cried through the entire thing and would deny it for the rest of his life. Teresa cooked for 4 days and refused all offers of help, and then complained about the lack of help. Marco stood up and gave a speech that was 11 words long. "I've worked for him 17 years. He's better now, that's all," and sat down to the loudest noise of the afternoon. Ivy walked her mother across the grass because she had appointed herself to it in April, and no one had been brave enough to raise an objection. Adrian Kovar adopted her formally the following March. She was 9. She chose to keep Cole and add Kovar, and made the decision entirely on her own after 4 days of visible deliberation, and announced it at the dinner table in the manner of a board resolution. The stopped watch sits on a shelf in that house to this day, empty, hinge loose, telling nobody the time. And every year on the 11th of August, without fail and without discussion, the three of them walk out to the bench at the end of the lawn and sit there until the light goes. A man who once believed that letting something close enough to touch him meant he'd already lost it. A woman who ran through 4 cities before she learned that stopping was the braver thing. And the child who walked through 40 armed men in a yellow dress and asked politely if she could borrow his shoulder. She could. She always could. That was the whole thing in the end, that the most dangerous man in Holloway Bay lost to harbor 40 men and 9 years of everything his father built, and never once, not for a single day, thought he'd made a bad trade.